We are family. I got all my sisters with me.
Dear friends of multiculturalism and diversity, and those who seek to increasingly overcome racism and related social illnesses, I'm going to hope to make my case to you that there are in fact no races.
Does tell us that we are quite unique as a species compared to chimps or gorillas, in that we are all very, very closely related. We share a common ancestor very recently. We are all, in a sense, Africans in disguise.
Neanderthals had larger brains than the new humans and bigger bodies. They used tools and cared for their dead. Yet on today's evidence, the two species were so distinct they could not interbreed. We do not carry Neanderthal genes.
Now, I was raised in a middle class, even arguably lower middle class, working class neighborhood on the west side of Indianapolis. Very racist part of town. My father was a liberal, in fact ultra-liberal, existentialist even, Christian Protestant minister. And though he taught me to be anti-racist, as he was a big fan of Lyndon Johnson's civil rights legislation, firmly believing in it, having come himself from a fundamentalist background in Arkansas, where he was taught that so many would be burning in hell. Well, he raised me an ultra-liberal, which made me a tiny minority in the mostly Baptist west side of Indianapolis. I found that Dad taught me one thing, but my civilization, the neighborhood, taught me another. I found that various John Birch Society members, in fact, in my own street of Myron Avenue in Indianapolis, thought that my father and his whole family were going to burn in hell because of our liberal views about the Bible. I remember an incident in first grade, Garden City Elementary School, where I was walking through the cafeteria with a young friend and an African-American woman walking behind us scared my friend. And he said to me, "Let's hurry. She's right behind us. Run, now." And I ran, and I remember to this day that woman's comment, "Don't run. I won't hurt you." Now, my father, of course, taught me this is nonsense. Homo sapiens, human beings, are human beings. But he had to grapple with racism in his small congregation in many other ways. My adopted sister, so-called Black Irish, these are Spanish people who used to live in Ireland before the redhead, blue-eyed people took over.
Mary dated a number of challenging customers, at least for a minister in a west side kind of racist part of town, starting with a Jewish dentist through a Puerto Rican Catholic fellow, finally culminating with an African-American fellow also just out of prison. All three wonderful guys, but each one would prove a challenge to the congregation had they found out. At one point even, my father, my sister told me later, found her and Renee making out on a car in front of the church. But he kept us cool, said, "How are you, Renee? How are you, Mary?" and kept on moving.
But when I moved to the Northwest Side in Pike High School, I found myself, frankly, part of a lower class. I was now grouped with the condo dwellers and the apartment dwellers. 18% of my school was African American, and I lived primarily with that community. Lower middle to middle African American classes moving into the richer side of Indianapolis. My bus trips were with those poor people, and though I was white and used to being upper class, if you will, as a minister's son on the west side, now I was lower class because I lived in the condominiums. No one knew my father in that part of town. I lost my privilege. For example, I can show you how segregation took place in that school. When we were divided into the physical education classifications, they did this according to swimming ability. Now mine was 0. Had they chosen tennis, I'd have been in the top level of phys ed. But I'm quite certain, knowing that most African Americans in those days weren't to have access to clubs where they could learn to swim, by dividing the physical ed levels into classes meant they could segregate the so-called races. So I found myself as just a terrible, terrible swimmer. I never liked swimming. My phys ed class consisted of myself and 3 other African American women. That was my first real exposure to African American community, apart from my sister's subsequent boyfriends. What I found during those many, many days, endless days of phys ed class, was that in fact these African American women shared my opinion about the snobby rich. It was a surprise, I think, as much to them as to me, to find that while we practiced archery, I remember one of the girls joking about how she'd like to use that bow and arrow on Mr. Males, the phys ed teacher. At Northwestern University, it was a fairly white school, but I did at that time sing in a black gospel choir. Now I was looking at this as an adventure into another culture. My mistake was not realizing that in singing with the Northwestern Community Ensemble, I was joining a deeply spiritual community. I found that though I was one of only 3 literate musicians in the choir, meaning I could read music, I didn't know how to sing those gospel songs like my African American friends. The bass dudes in that choir felt that music in a way I would never be able to feel. At Northwestern, I took up the study of Buddhism with Dr. Ishii Yamada of Tokyo University. And there I learned such a very different perspective on Western culture. He couldn't comprehend, for example, how the Western monotheisms could possibly convince so many billions of people with such illogical doctrines. I went to the University of Cambridge on a fluke. A professor recommended I apply. And I got in. I got a scholarship from a church to go. And there again I found myself a second-class citizen. Why? Well, anybody's American accent at Cambridge makes you a second-class citizen, at least in the late 1980s, 1987 to 1990. I found out what it's like to have all my papers covered with red, as Old Testament professor scribbled out all my American spellings and replaced them with British spellings. Now I learned my little comeback to them: you better learn to like the way I speak, because your grandchildren are going to sound like me. Now, when I went to the University of Chicago for my Master of Divinity, my ministry degree, then I found the most racist situation I've ever encountered in my life, and that's the University of Chicago's placement in Hyde Park, in the south side of Chicago. The security police at the University of Chicago were giant, hulking Terminator-style men. I, in fact, saw one lift an African-American man up with one hand in the air, shaking him in a restaurant as an arrest. I got robbed 3 times in that neighborhood, but I didn't blame anyone, because the neighborhood was really devastated by the university in many ways. Cultural areas burned down to build new student housing. At the University of Wisconsin, I studied with Geshe Lundum Sopa, a Tibetan, because I wanted to see what the Tibetans had to say about Buddhist philosophy, especially Indian philosophy. What was his perspective on the Japanese and Chinese, as I had learned what the Japanese and Chinese perspective was with regard to Tibetans.
My studies with Geshe Sopa of the Old Buddhist Studies program at the University of Wisconsin left me quite convinced that Japanese can be as biased about Tibetans as Tibetans can be biased about Japanese. This was what I learned through studies with Geshe Sopa, Tibetan, and Ishii Yamada, my Japanese advisor. My plan is to continue producing videographies through my students on comparative religion and philosophy. With 50,000 views and counting, and comments from around the world, I know I've made some impact on the lives of a number who have emailed me to say so. This is where I am, is focusing on class and culture, and as an agent of change, education, I believe, is the key to wiping out the ignorance that causes continued pain, the pain we call racism.